Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hello and welcome. I am Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce you to Dr. Hanson, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. There is a future of medicine where a brain surgeon in Stockholm will remove a brain tumor from a patient in Brazil using remote robotic surgical hands. Telehealth software will serve as a monitoring nurse for chronically ill patients, and electronic noses will detect infection based on a person's breath. None of this is science fiction, and all of it is currently being used in some of the best hospitals in the country. Dr. Hanson will discuss his own work with technological advances at the edge of medicine and what it means for our future. Dr. William Hanson is an anesthesiologist and chief of intensive care at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, as well as an associated faculty member of the Computer Science Department at Princeton University, where he teaches a course in computers and medicine. He is often quoted in USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and has been profiled in Popular Science and New Scientist. So please join me today in welcoming Dr. Hanson to Microsoft to discuss his new book, The Edge of Medicine.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hi, everybody. Welcome back from vacation. Just to amplify a little bit on what Kirsten said about what I do, I work in the intensive care units and the cardiac ORs at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. So I'm working with arguably the highest tech sort of medicine, and I'll show you where that is probably what you would call high tech, and other places where it's very low tech. And this book is sort of an attempt to look at some of the technologies that I think are going to change the way that we practice in the future quite dramatically. And I may have it right, I may have it wrong, but it's at least worth thinking about as we discuss it. So this is a quotation from the book. Although we don't know precisely when, at some point primate social activities such as mutual grooming and nitpicking transitioned into the beginnings of early human medicine. The first medical tools people or primates used were their senses of sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing. And they weren't just observant, they acted on their observations. So some of you will recognize this photograph from a movie. Anyone want to throw out a 2001, of course. So this was Stanley Kubrick's idea of what the first weapon was. It's a thigh bone. Which takes us on to what I think is probably the first medical tool, and I'll show you that in a second. This is some monkeys on a beach nitpicking and looking for food and grooming their companions. And I would bet, this is a bad picture, that what they found was something like this, which is a large pimple or abscess or collection under the skin of pus. And that the first medical instrument was a fingernail or a monkey's, sharp point on their finger. And that was a very long time ago, but so is this. This is a skull from an archaeological dig someplace that has a hole in it. And we know from archaeological expeditions and many skulls that this is what's called a trepanned or trephined skull. So there's a hole in the skull that if you look at the edges, there's actually healing of the skull there. And you can probably see that there's some deformation of the skull around the hole, which is what they probably did, and we have some record of this in some cultures, is they scraped the skull around until they penetrated the skull. And it's not at all clear what people were doing or what they thought they were doing or why they did it. Was it to let vapors out, or was it some religious activity, or was it perhaps to treat something like a collection of blood under the skull in the way that we still trephine or trepan skulls today. So this is a treatment that we still use in modern ICUs and operating rooms. This is Hippocrates, who was the sort of father of medicine, the Hippocratic Oath derives from Hippocrates. He used his senses quite intelligently, and in fact described several diseases by their smell, the smell and the breath of patients. There's a disease smell called fetor hepaticus, which is the smell of the breath of someone with liver failure. It's a sort of a musky smell. People with renal or kidney failure have not surprisingly, the smell of urine on their breath. People with diabetes have the smell of juicy fruit gum, which is ketoacidosis. There are any number of different smells with different diseases. And in fact, we're now just using, as Kirsten mentioned, an electronic nose in breath analysis as a way to objectify that otherwise sort of elusive scent. So, long time ago, people were using primitive senses, their sense of touch, their fingers, their sense of smell, their taste. Hippocrates tasted the urine of his patients to determine whether or not there was sugar in the urine. Nowadays, we're using much more sophisticated tools, but they're all derived from those original senses because that's what we know. So I'm going to go through the book sort of chapter by chapter. I divided this up to think in terms of, the way I thought about this book was in terms of enabling technologies, and you may or may not agree with the way I've gone about it, but the first chapter is called Deus Ex Machina, and the idea here is that the God of the machine, something in some cases, there's some mechanism that operates behind many of the machines in a modern hospital that the patient doesn't really even see. So the hospital of the future will have many of these, and I'll show you one that's just mind-boggling, which is a proton beam therapy device in a second. But I wanted to start with this image. This is a watering hole or a water hole taken from a satellite view, as you can see. This is sort of where I think we are in medicine right now. There's this amount of money, and there's this number of entities that want access to that money. It may be patients, it may be insurers, it may be device manufacturers, software manufacturers, or what have you. And there's a dwindling supply of that money. We're all aware of the fact that we've got a lot of healthcare requirements or desires, and we have a dwindling amount of money to finance that. This actually, I think, is in Egypt. You can see this sort of, I noticed this morning, there's a silhouette here cast by the sun that's over here somewhere, and it's a guy on a camel. But the idea is that we're running out of money. I mean, frankly, 20% of the GDP being devoted to healthcare seems excessive to even someone like me who benefits from those dollars. This is a couple of pictures of the gantries that are used in a proton beam therapy center. So let me describe that very quickly. We're building one of these at Penn right now. This is basically a facility that allows us to take protons, accelerate them to a certain speed, and then they're trained using a nozzle built into this gantry on the patient who's on this bed. And they enter the patient's body, and they come to a very precise point, and they release their radiation without damaging anything around it. They're like smart weapons that arrive, release the radiation, and you can irradiate a 1 or 2 millimeter tumor in the iris of the eye, leaving the rest of the eye intact, something you can't do with current radiation. So proton beam therapy is going to explode. A lot of companies and entities are trying to build these things. These are multi-million-dollar facilities. Ours is in a building. The cyclotron and the treatment gantries are underground. They're shielded by 10 feet of cement. They cost a lot of money, and they're being used for things like the treatment of prostate cancer, for which we have 5 or 6 alternative treatment modalities, including robotic prostatectomies and hormonal therapies and prostate therapy. I mean, proton beam therapy is nice because you can irradiate this prostate, which is surrounded by a lot of critical structures like the colon, the testicles, the bladder, and some of the complications of current treatments are things like incontinence and the like, and impotence. And people are very concerned about that. They want something that's smart, but obviously very expensive. We also have specialty hospitals. This is the kind of bed that we have more and more of, unfortunately, in our hospital, which is a bariatric bed, a bed for obese patients. There are now bariatric hospitals for obese patient treatment. So people have gone into this sort of ecological niche to treat obesity, which is clearly a growing problem, but we're funding it. Right now there's money for that kind of thing, but you can imagine that the funding for this specialty hospital might go away with a stroke of a pen under the new administration. So this is advanced medicine, but it's treating a disease of our own making. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. There's also hospitals that are creating online presence. This is a Second Life website for a new hospital that allows people to sort of tour the facilities and the like. I don't know exactly how that fits into patient care, but people are branching into every niche with their concepts of healthcare. I think one of the things that we're likely to see in the near future is franchises or hospitals that have networked across the world. The Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, Harvard, Penn to a certain degree have begun to open facilities overseas that are affiliated with them, and with the increasing ability to deliver healthcare over networks, as we'll talk about, I think it's very likely that we'll see, just as you see a Starbucks or a McDonald's or some other familiar sign like Microsoft in overseas locations, you're very likely to see the Cleveland Clinic, the MGH, the Mayo Clinic storefronts or clinic fronts in the future. And the technologies that I'll talk about in the next couple of minutes will enable this. So we're in the midst of an evolutionary explosion in medical technology. Diversification is occurring despite or perhaps as a result of growing resource constraints. So as the money gets tighter, there is a lot of diversification in medicine. An optimist view, and one I hope you'll share by the end of the book or the talk, is that medicine in the future will, or in fact must be, preventative rather than the rearguard action it too often seems to be today. And this is sort of my vision from my vantage point, at my point in my career, of what I think healthcare is like. This is one of those abstract slides that you really have to walk your way through, but I think we're all born with a set of pickup sticks that are allocated in some way, some random or non-random way. And as we get older, whether you smoke, you may pull a stick out. If you don't exercise, you're obese, you may pull another stick out. If you don't, if you engage in certain hazardous activities or expose to certain chemicals, another stick. And eventually, something happens, the sticks fall down, and you're in some new equilibrium. But the idea I think that we need to think about in healthcare is figuring out ways to stop pulling out sticks that we can avoid pulling out sticks. So don't smoke. Don't eat inappropriately. And you don't end up necessarily in my intensive care unit after your heart surgery. So a lot of this is going to be on us to take care of ourselves and keep this bundle of sticks up as intact as possible for as long as possible. Second chapter is about networks, and this is, I come here with some trepidation to talk about this part of it, but here's another movie that came to mind when I thought about this. Anybody know this movie? Brazil. Who was that? Exactly. This is Robert De Niro in a movie called Brazil, and a lot of the backdrop of the movie is conduits or piping. And to me, that's kind of like what our networks have become. We have a lot of conduits or piping that extend from, the original sort of backbone core internet to the original office networks, and they sort of married up and intercalated, and now you've got these widely branched networks, for banking and for our PCs, and medicine is well behind that. I mean, medicine is about 10 or 15 years behind where many other industries are. But we're getting there. So two paradigms that we think about in medicine are what's called a store and forward paradigm, where an example of this is a radiology approach that, has anybody here heard of Nighthawk? Right. So Nighthawk was born of the concept of a California radiologist who said, people need to have films read at night by experts, but the experts aren't awake at night. So maybe if I put a bunch of experts in a location and have them stay up all night, then I can work with hospitals and sell that service. So he did that for a while. The California radiologists chose at some point to say, we want to be more expensive than the market can bear, or they didn't want to stay up at night, and eventually he relocated the experts to Australia, so they're 12 hours out of sync with the consumers. And many people believe that radiology, as we now know it, where you have an employed group of radiologists in a hospital, will go away, and it'll go to the subscription kind of service where you get your radiology readings from online. I think dermatology is susceptible to that kind of thing, and frankly, some of what I do currently as an intensive care provider is also eligible to be provided that way. And we have what's called an eye in the sky form of intensive care telemedicine that I run one of these programs at our hospital where we cover upwards of 100 ICU beds from a central location with an intensivist who's awake at night and can sort of direct activities as long as they don't require his or her hands on the patient. So if there's a nurse or a resident or a trainee who's working at the bedside, they need help, they can call on the awake intensivist who's looking at these patients. And I should say that if you guys have questions as we go forward, you can either ask now or as time permits at the end. So this is what this idea looks like. We're typically working at night in my operation. We have a clerk, a nurse, or a doctor, so there's a clerk, a doctor, and a nurse, and they're looking at bedside feeds from patients in 75 to 100 ICU beds around the health system. And it could be around the health system, it could be around Ohio, it could be around the world. There's no reason that this is obviously linked to any location. And there's some smart software that trolls through these feeds and says, so-and-so's blood pressure is going up and their heart rate's going down. Come look at me. And this is the kind of thing that can also be outsourced. And we're looking now at helping out people in Maine from Philadelphia. There are people that are covering patients in Hawaii from California. I think we'll see more and more of that kind of thing. But again, this software that lives at the core of this thing is pretty primitive from your standards. And there's a lot that could be done there. And I'll show you more of this in a second. So I believe that this is where we're headed in medicine as we proceed from a localized and provincial patient care model, so like the local community hospital, to one in which backbone medical networks ramify or branch out towards bedside devices, which are in many cases digital, but not intelligent yet, eventually forming a continuous web in the same way that the original office networks sort of built their way towards the backbone internet, and they married at some point, in which any authorized human or computer node on the network has ready access to the required medical information from any other node. So I use this word authorized, obviously, with a lot of forethought, because medical healthcare information is very sacrosanct. This is somebody's hacked photograph. I don't believe this actually exists. I think these are two iPhones, and the idea here is that you might at some point be able to many of you could probably tell me if this is true or not, whether they've created something where you can use cameras and do two-way video over the iPhone. Anybody know that? I don't think it's here yet. It's been talked about. I don't think it's here yet. But the idea here would be this is very useful if you were able to have this two-way communication between a physician who's off-site moving around but has expertise and some other person who needs access to that expertise, as it would be for any other similar kind of application. This is another hack here. This is a cell phone, I think, that's been hacked where the camera is used to transilluminate a slide of blood. And there's you all may have seen this. There was on Wired a couple of weeks ago. And because of the cell sizes of bloods, you can sort of do a primitive blood analysis using this hack software and hardware. And this is the kind of thing that, again, would allow you to sort of take medical information from somebody who's located out in the world and do some pre-analysis and then get it to somebody who can do something about it. Yeah? I think it is, yeah.
MSR funded that work.
Oh, is that right? Great. Well, it's interesting. I met with a guy named Bill Siemering, who many of you will not know, but you'll know who he is when I tell you in a second. He is the guy who basically is credited with founding National Public Radio. And he's currently working with radio in developing countries, in fact, in Africa. And he's interested in taking some combination of cell phone technology and radio and marrying that up to create a healthcare network of sorts, telemedicine network in Africa, where many, many people have cell phones, and they use text messaging a lot because it's cheap. And if you could sort of turn that into some medical two-way conduit, you could do a lot for people in Africa. I don't want to suggest that all of what I'm talking about here is something that has to do with Western medicine. There are applications that can be used, as the Gates Foundation has done, for the large parts of the world that need something a lot less than a proton beam facility, and they'll never have access to it. Artificial intelligence, again, I approach this somewhat tentatively, but I've thought about this for a long time. In medicine, there's nothing like that yet, although we're on the verge of a bunch of things. So this, of course, is 2001 again, and HAL, but I did see Wall-E the other day, and the bad actor on the bridge with the human is HAL again. Have you all seen that? So the thing that's trying to drive the ship has HAL's eye, which I just recognized, probably very obvious to everybody else. But this is a new item. This is the McSleepy. And the McSleepy is a automated anesthesia administration device. And what it takes is it takes something that talks about how well paralyzed the patient is, something that monitors the brain waves, and a couple of other features, and feeds them into some, again, primitive software, which then in turn tells these three automated pumps how much paralytic, how much sleepy medication, and how much whatever to give. These sorts of devices I think we'll see more and more of. For some reason, medicine's been resistant to it, but when you think about it, when you're on an airplane and the plane's on autopilot, that autopilot is doing a lot more complex management of the ailerons and the rudders and the power than anything that we do in medicine, and there are many hundred people on that plane and there's one patient on that bed, so it's not a big leap. Modern programs can quickly learn about a disease's characteristics from a database of patients that a human physician might never see in a lifetime's worth of practice. You know, we do automated mortgage analysis. There's all sorts of automated tools. The upside is it's quick. The downside, of course, is what we saw in the last 6 months in the financial markets, where very smart people built very smart software that did very bad things all by itself, or so they say. So this is something that I used just as a demonstration project a couple years ago, and I just want to show you conceptually what, the kind of thing that we could use. This is the heart rate from a low value to a high value on this axis. This is something that says how well filled is the heart. So if it's empty, somebody's dehydrated or they've bled out. So low to high, and this is how well the heart is performing. So I used a neurofuzzy program, which has neural network married up to fuzzy logic. The reasons I could explain if somebody has a question afterwards. But the idea was for this surface to represent what's happening with the patient as the patient spends time in the ICU. And this could be about a patient or a population of patients. And basically, the thing sort of analyzes it and it learns about where the patient performs best. So what is the best heart rate for that patient, and how much blood does that patient want to have in their heart to get to this optimal central value. A lot of room for that kind of thing. We have a lot of stuff that comes into our ICU machines that then gets transcribed into a manual record, as I'll show you in a second, and it's ridiculous. This is digital information that's available for analysis. We don't analyze it. This is, forgive me here, the competitor, and this is a sort of a silly pet trick, but this is, again, the kind of idea on a more global scale of how just the availability of masses of data can help us learn things that we don't learn about traditionally with our tools. This is a Google flu trends thing. I'm sure you guys saw this. Google looking for people searching for flu and something else discovered this uptick in a geographic area of that search well in advance of the actual flu data that the CDC analyzed 2 weeks ahead of time. So again, a lot of room for smart tools that have access to large data sets to do reasonably simple things. The next area I want to talk about quickly is data visualization. Again, an area that you've all spent a lot of time thinking about corporately, and I think is critical in medicine. We still work with numbers. So we transcribe down a blood pressure of 132 over 57, as if there's some magic about that least important digit. Who cares if it's 137, 135? Our creatinine is 1.1. I don't really care whether it's 1.1 or 1. There's this magic about these numbers that's silly. It's more the behavior over time that's much more critical. So this is what I walk into every day in the operating room in the ICU, is this glorified oscilloscope. This is something from the 60s. They've put color on it. They've got 2 or 3 waveforms here. But we're still talking about 5 seconds worth of data, a number, another number, and another number. And my job is to take this 5 seconds, fiddle it around in my head, and make meaningful decisions based on the 5 seconds that I see there. And if the 5 seconds don't work out and I walk in, the 5 seconds have passed, fortunately I have this backup, which is, so there's a highly skilled nurse at the bedside who's looking at those 5 seconds, and every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, she is licking her whatever, pen, pencil, carefully transcribing that down into these very complicated columns of stuff, in this case mostly legibly, and then I have to come by on rounds and look at this stuff and say, okay, what happened? And this is where we need your help. Yeah?
Is this where the electronic medical records, would all this be captured in those, or no?
Yeah, and I'll get to that, but the medical records, now, I haven't seen, the end display of Health Vault yet. I'll get to that at the end. But the medical records that we see nowadays, somebody has very intelligently essentially taken Excel, and they've copied and pasted this into Excel. So I have the same problem all over again. So the current first generation of medical records is not data visualization, it's data transcription. It takes this manual step out, but it's basically taking that data and porting it into columns. I don't need that, as I'll show you in a second. Now, does anybody recognize this sketch? Yeah. The cholera map. John Snow, who was an anesthesiologist, interestingly, but who was working for the Queen. And last question is, who sort of glorified this map originally? Edward Tufte, right. So critical pieces here. Edward Tufte, sort of the dean, as many of you know, of data visualization. And the idea here, for those of you who don't know this map, is this is a water pump, and that's a water pump, and that's a water pump, and that's a water pump. And all of these dots are cases of cholera. And all John Snow did was to say, let's take a backdrop, a geographic backdrop, the map of this portion of London. Let's put dots on it where the cholera cases are, and let's see if there's any relationship between them and, say, these pumps. And of course, as it turns out, this pump handle was contaminated and was the point source of the cholera epidemic. And there's been a great book written about this. Tufte uses this as data visualization. This is now I can look at this data at a glance and say, I get it. I can't do that with the previous 2 slides. I'm an expert, and I go in there and sort of sort my way through it, but I could walk into a room, look at this at one glance, and say, I get it. That's what we need. This is a display wall, very much like you all have developed. This is actually something, when I was at Princeton, I'm no longer teaching there, so that was a little, I got an extra Benny there from Kirsten, but I did teach there for a while, and one of the things that they had developed there, a guy named Kai Lee, who some of you may know is a good friend of mine, computer scientist, whose apartment I'm staying with right now with my son, Addie, who's here in the front row, developed a display wall at Princeton, and this was a bunch of rear-projected, originally high-resolution screens married up and multiplexed into a larger 16-megapixel display, which is now being used at the Genomics Center at Princeton to look at these very pretty Christmas sort of colors. But these are underexpressed or overexpressed, depending on it's red or green, genes in yeast. So what? Well, if you think about this, let's take a bunch of patients with prostate cancer and look at their genetics and see, is there a cluster of people with overexpressed genes of one sort? Is there some relationship between that gene and a disease? You can only do that when you're looking at this kind of a scale. And this is one of your colleagues. I don't know who this is. Maybe you all do. Working with a touch surface, one of your touch surfaces. And I think this is the kind of display we need for data visualization if done intelligently in hospitals. I'll show you a video of that in a second. But whether you're a modern commuter driving down a superhighway at 70 miles an hour with hundreds of other drivers, or a highly skilled Aboriginal hunter in the rainforest of New Guinea, you are well equipped to process vast amounts of visual information. This last thing, my son and I and my family went to Costa Rica last spring, and we were going through a rainforest looking for indigenous interesting animals. And of course, we couldn't see any of them. But this guy would walk down and he goes, you know, there's a parrot, there's something hanging upside down, there's a bat, there's a this, that, and the other thing. And that landscape was for him the same as us driving down a superhighway, you know, at 80 miles an hour, and you see the slightest veer this way or the other, and you're processing it all visually because that's what your brain's wired to do. It's not wired to process something that says, you know, the numeric representation of that same behavior on your dashboard. You're not looking at the number on your speedometer. So this is a guy who works on this display wall at Princeton, and this is the kind of thing that we probably ought to be able to do in our ICUs and in our operating rooms. He's working with a genome map here, you know, scrolling. He's working with a large-scale display. He's able to sort of say, okay, this looks interesting. Let's zoom in on this, then do something with it. I'm sure you've got, you know, much more sophisticated pictures of this, but I wasn't able to get them off of the internet successfully. Okay, robotics, another sort of interesting new technology. How about this movie? Did I stump you? All right, so this is Julie Christie. This is a movie called Demon Seed, where this robot had amorous intentions that I won't get into for some of our younger audience here. But this is what our operating rooms look like. Sorry, this is one of my favorite paintings. This is a painting at Penn. This was an 1800s era operating room. So this is Dr. Agnew, who's a famous Penn physician. This is a patient having a mastectomy. There's the anesthetist. These are the operators. He doesn't even really get into the picture too much. He's lecturing in this open theater. There's no hint of sterile drapes. The predecessor picture, the guy wasn't even wearing gloves. He's at least got gloves on. This is Thomas Eakins' painting, and the Gross Clinic, which is the partner to this thing, is much more dark. But that's the operating room of the late 1800s. This is a mock-up. This is not a real operating. This is from the Da Vinci Corporation. But here's the surgeon. Here's the operating robot. This is a sort of an assistant standing by. And we do this every day. Prostates, head and neck operations, heart surgery. And as I'm sure you know, he has hand-operated devices. He's working with his feet. There's some pre-processed visual information. It's 3D. It's defogged. He can zoom in and zoom out. He's got a clutch to move his camera around. And he's operating with instruments like this, not too dissimilar from the ones we saw over in the Microsoft store a couple of minutes ago with the Xbox devices. It's sort of the same thing, really, when you think about it. And they're very dexterous. These are not yet haptic, but they will be, so you have some force feedback as to what the tissue feels like before you rip it, which is important for obvious reasons. But you know, these robotic devices are getting much more dexterous. This is something that there's a lot of interest, as I'm sure you know. DARPA and many other governmental entities right now are looking at ways to help out the people who are injured or have amputated limbs from Iraq. The IEDs, the diseases of this war have been amputations and head injuries and PTSD. So there's a lot of funding for robotic advances. And this is what the business end of the instruments look like. This is a needle driver and a pickup. So I'll show you a very poor video of this in a second. But the robot is driving the needle through and we picked up by this. And they're operating essentially as if their hands were doing it. But they have many more degrees of freedom, so they can operate around corners. Everybody understands what I mean by that, right? So This is a video of somebody doing, I think, an operation on the esophagus. And so this is a cautery burning, and the other thing is pulling the tissue away, which is what a surgeon would typically do, grab with forceps, burn and pull the tissue away, dissect. So there's a lot of cautery action here, and so on. So in this case, I think they're actually dissecting this blood vessel off of the chest wall for heart surgery, come to think of it. So with our hands and minds, we design tools that mimic, translate, and extend our own hands and minds. You think about, what that monkey was doing with his fingernail. This is the same sort of thing, only many eras later. Robotic tools and techniques will proliferate in the future of medicine in ways that we're only beginning to imagine. So here's an example of this, very simple. All that stuff went through holes in the body. In the future, those robotic instruments will not be those big. That first generation of instruments is huge. The next generation will be much smaller, and they'll probably be like a colonoscope. So they'll go in through the stomach, they'll cut a hole in the stomach and operate on the gallbladder, and there'll never be an incision on the body. So Arnold Schwarzenegger can have his gallbladder out and still maintain his ripped abdomen. And I use that not only as an example of Schwarzenegger, because he actually had open heart surgery and a very complicated course. And in his last movie, which was done after that, he's wearing a prosthetic chest. Just fun little fact to know. Hope I didn't disillusion any of you. This is a guy named Dr. Ansari who is sitting in Vancouver, I think, operating, in this case, laparoscopically. He's not operating yet robotically, although he does this, on patients in rural Canada. So he's operating at a distance over a robotic console. No reason why that guy who's several feet from the bedside couldn't be several hundred miles from the bedside. And in fact, this same guy has been working with NASA on the Nemo underwater simulated space station, where they have people train in extreme environments. And they've done demonstration projects where they have this guy sitting in Canada operating on something that's in this underwater space station to, what would be the challenges in operating on somebody who's actually in space. Yeah?
What kind of latency would the surgeon experience there between taking action and then the action?
Well, right. So, one of the things that's important for this is there is a guy who's done a transatlantic gallbladder operation. And you'd obviously have to have guarantees of service. So you need to have a guaranteed bandwidth of a certain sort and a fallback position if, things went very awry. But, you'd obviously need to have significant bandwidth here. But I don't think, I don't think there's any hidden bandwidth that we're not aware of. It's just what you would think about for the messaging to the operating instrument and the visual field coming back. And you don't need to have high-resolution images, really, for most of what's done there. So you could probably tell better than I could exactly what the bandwidth would be, but the guarantees of service would have to be there. Okay, neural interfaces. This is another thing that I think is really interesting, and again, this is sort of in your sweet spot. I use the term the thinkable here because this comes from a wonderful movie that I would recommend you all look at some point called A Brief History of Time, which is about Stephen Hawking. And it was done about Hawking. It's obviously the same name as the book. It looks like you may have seen the movie. It's spectacular. It's one of the most spectacular movies I've ever seen. It's on YouTube, I think. If you look up A Brief History of Time, there's a chicken in the beginning. And some great background music, and it's well worth looking at. Another movie here. Anybody? Manchurian Candidate, right. So mind control. So this again, I think that actually this may be Frank Sinatra. Right? He's in this movie. He's one of the main characters in the movie. This, of course, is not Frank Sinatra. This is Stephen Hawking, and this is him in his wheelchair, probably at the university, which was done over in a big way to make it possible for him to move around. And as you all know, he's working through a device where he constructs his sentences and then a speech synthesizer, the same one that used to do the weather reports. on NOAA, the National Oceanographic and whatever the AA thing is. So the automated Yeah, so that voice was originally the same voice that Hawking used, and they've moved on. It's an old DEC program. But this is what he has to work with here. So this is his right knee, this is his left knee, this is a cord, and this is where the action is in this little clip. This is from that movie. That's what's happening in this movie. That's all, in this stretch. And what he's doing is, with tapping on a little click pad, he's constructing his sentences, which are then fed to a voice synthesizer or a text product. This is obviously an old screen, but that's how he wrote A Brief History of Time. So interesting, this is him in his office, and anybody know who that is? Marilyn Monroe. So he's kind of a puckish guy. He's got a very funny sense of humor from what one can tell from seeing this movie. But this is where I started. So I started as a student, medical student, working in what was called data processing at the University of Pennsylvania back in the 1974. And some of you older guys may remember this program called Zork, which was a mainframe-based MIT-created program with this massive I told my kids about this game, and they kind of scoffed. They said, that's ridiculous. And I got them on the game, and they were sort of hooked very quickly. But what you get is you're in an open field west of a big white house with a boarded front door. There's a small mailbox there. And then you're supposed to figure out how to negotiate your way through this complicated underworld environment and deal with ogres and grus and swords and get treasure and all that kind of stuff. This is 30 years ago. This game I played over a 300 baud acoustic coupler. And so that's the backdrop. That's 30 years ago. So just keep that in mind as we go into this next couple of slides. This is a guy from the University of Illinois and his partner, who's not paralyzed, who's sitting in a wheelchair, and who has this device called an audio, which I'll show you here. And this is, again, a very pixelated, and I apologize, but it's compelling, I think. So this is them, this is their first video. They're sitting in a hallway of what looks like there's a dorm or a schoolroom. And here's the guy. Here's his partner sitting in the chair. They obviously aren't wearing the suits because they're not making venture capital pitch. But what he has, as you'll see in a minute, is a dog collar on that has two sensors over his neck. And the sensors are reading signals going to his vocal cords. And all he does to navigate with this wheelchair is think what he would do to vocalize commands like move left, move right. So he's basically driving this wheelchair by thinking what the words would be and how he would move his muscles to move the chair. I have a colleague at, oops, watch that door. A colleague at Penn who has ALS, who's a neurologist, who's wearing a cap that has a bunch of EEG sensors that are, he just puts this cap on and his skull is shaved, and he operates his computer with this totally non-invasive, admittedly low bandwidth at present neural interface. 30 years from now, 10 years from now, it's not going to be low bandwidth anymore. There are not going to be keyboards. There won't be mice. You're going to be doing a lot of stuff directly through devices of some sort that are not implanted. So I think that's where we're headed, and that's not medicine. That's outside of medicine. Yeah?
Do you know what the bandwidth of these devices are?
I don't. But, 300 baud to what we deal with now, whatever they are, it's low. Whatever they'll be, it's high. Because we're getting better resolution. We understand how the brain works better. We can marry up EEG and functional imaging using functional MRI. All of that stuff is in its infancy and growing really rapidly. So Hawking's mother in this book says he does believe very intensely in the almost infinite possibility of the human mind. I don't think that thought should be restricted at all. Why shouldn't you go on thinking about the unthinkable? Think how many things were unthinkable a century ago, and people have thought them, and often they seem quite unpractical, British term. He's a searcher. People must think. They must go on thinking. They must try to extend the boundaries of human knowledge, which Hawking has certainly done. This is a guy who was working with a power thing, like a power in our house went out a couple of days ago, and the pole went over, and those coupling devices, and he basically lost both arms from an electrical accident. This arm is over his chest, and they've rerouted the nerves from his stump onto his chest wall to specific locations, and there are sensors over those locations on the skin that take the muscle signals and then operate this arm. So he can basically move his arm around quite dexterously with this rerouted nervous system. And in fact, they're now, I think, trying to put things that will press back to give him some sense of sensation and force feedback. So there are some very remarkable things that are out there already. Which one was what one? This is another chapter on manufactured things for implantation in humans. This is easy, the fly. But here you've got this guy's head on a fly body, which is a fun little cinematic device. But we're doing this kind of stuff. Anybody know what this is? Nope.
It's like a valve.
It's a heart valve. It's the first heart valve. So there's still some of these around. The blood flow comes out of the heart. The ball pushes up. Blood goes around. It's very bad. It beats the blood up very significantly. So it's had some bad consequences. But we still see this occasion the much more advanced carbon-based solutions in the present, and pig valve and artificial tissue valves. But where this came from was from this. This is a patent for a bottle top. So the idea was this thing was plonked on a bottle in the bar. Bartender came over, poured it, set it upright. The thing popped down, and the flies wouldn't fly in there. The fruit flies, I don't know if you drink red wine, white wine, whatever. I get fruit flies in my wine when they're around the kitchen. So somebody said, I've got it. We'll use a bottle stopper for a heart valve. The current generation of valves are based on things that were used for canals in India that open with the incoming tide and they slam shut with the outgoing tide, or vice versa. So humans are very adept at taking things that are out there in the world and turning them into something you can put into the human body. As I've said here, this is actually a trachea. That some of you probably saw this recently. A woman had a disease, tuberculosis, where her trachea collapsed on one side. And so what they did was they took a cadaver trachea, they stripped it of all the cells of the cadaver, and they repopulated it with stem cells from that woman. And then they reimplanted it. So basically there's this sort of scaffolding there that's not immunologically significant. It's covered with cells that are okay, and she's good to go. That's the kind of stuff we're doing with hips, with teeth, with, any number of things. We're putting in things in the blood vessels to expand them. We put coils to collapse aneurysms. The major issue in all these cases is how do you put this thing in and not have the body then react poorly to it? Miniaturization, we don't talk about this, but I think this is critical and something very important to understand, that this chapter and the next one, that we're quickly getting smaller and smaller with what we can do in the human body. This is a automatic implantable cardio defibrillator that's about 3 or 4. It's a little bit larger than a couple $50, and it has the intelligence that allows it to analyze the heart rate, treat with pacing if appropriate, or defibrillate. I talked about this yesterday in another interview. This is basically a doctor. It's an emancipated machine inside the body that's been given the capability to diagnose and then do something very dramatic like discharge electricity into your heart all by itself on the street. And there's going to be a lot more devices like that in the coming future. Miniature medical devices for personal use. We may have them implanted or on our body, but miniaturization, there's more smarts and smaller packages, as you all well know. And they haven't been applied to medicine yet, but they are going to be. This is anti-seizure electrodes that are implanted in the brain with the same kind of interrogation and discharge capabilities. At the bottom is about nanotechnology, which is, again, miniaturization taken one step beyond. There's a quotation that goes, I've heard this said of various people, but some astronomer was describing to a lay audience, the world is basically surrounded by planets, and it's just up there in the space. And as the story goes, some little old lady from the back of the room says, no. It's actually the planet on top of a turtle. And the lecturer says, well, what's under the turtles? The turtle, and the little lady said, of course, it's turtles all the way down, which, at some point you get to the bottom. And what is at the bottom? Well, Richard Feynman, the physicist, who's done all sorts of extraordinary things, a very fascinating man. My son, who's been reading my book, noticed that I had put in there something to the effect that he, at some point, would go to topless bars to get his thinking clear and do most of his great research there in California. But he gave a lecture about nanotechnology in the 60s and sort of opened up this idea that there were remarkable things you could do with molecules. And that spawned the movie here, which, of course, is Fantastic Voyage. This is Raquel Welch in her better days and in a better outfit. And actually, Asimov wrote the book based on the movie as maybe the first application of that. But this is what we're doing now. These are carbon nanotubes, and this is DNA or RNA. We're able to attach organic molecules to man-made scaffolding. You could embed copper or some other metal inside these things and put them in the bloodstream. A cancer cell would say, okay, I recognize this molecule. This is something I need. Take it into the cell, and then you could irradiate the patient with sound or light at a certain frequency that would activate or cause the copper or whatever metal you've got embedded to heat up, and you kill that individual cancer cell. So there are ways to actually act at the level of individual cells with man-made little machines. That's what nanotechnology for diagnostics and treatments is going to give us, again, in the very near future, I think. Yeah?
The cancer cell will take it rather than normal cell?
Again, I'm not... cancer cells have certain receptors that allow them to propagate in ways that normal cells don't ordinarily do. So there are ways that you can identify a cancer cell as such by some specific mutation, which would then allow it to take in this. Or maybe it's just cancer cells take in much more of this kind of thing than a normal cell, so you can kill a cancer cells much more effectively. So nanotechnology holds promise for energy production, pollution, remediation, et cetera. And it's going to play into medicine in a big way very soon, and it's already very big on the minds of the drug companies. Now, there are some visionaries who said, well, eventually we'll have these little, this is a respiracyte. The idea here is that you'll have some little thing that can actually pack in much more oxygen and carbon dioxide, swapping it in and out appropriately, than a regular red cell, small enough to get through the blood vessels. And this guy has hypothesized that you could get an injection of about 20 cc's of these bad boys and sit on the bottom of the pool for about 20 minutes. No problem. And at least the physics in his mind are there, and that you could have respiracytes that dock with some, this is not likely to happen, but what I've showed you in the previous slide is happening. at this molecular level. Couple last things I want to go through. Cryotherapeutics, this is a picture of somebody in a bath of ice with an anesthetist, and someone's going to operate on that patient. We know that we can cool patients down and operate on them safely. One of the things I do every day I'm in the operating room nowadays is we take a patient who needs to have their aortic arch repaired, cool them down to 50 degrees or so, take all the blood out of their body. So they're basically, their brain is quiet, their heart is stopped, they're dead. For all intents and purposes, we operate on them for a half an hour, and then we put the blood back in, warm them up, and we're good to go. So cold is being used therapeutically. This is a guy who had a heart attack, went down, was brought, I mean, this is the kind of thing that could happen in Seattle, of all places where CPR is so well known, brought into the hospital and cooled for 3 days, and the expected brain injury didn't occur because of the cold, which down-regulated the destructive thing that happens to the brain after a period of low blood flow. So, yeah.
Use more often.
Well, it is. It's about to be used more often. In fact, New York City has just said, we will have our ambulances bypass hospitals that don't offer this therapy in favor of hospitals that do. But this is, again, I'm talking about things that are just there. And medicine innovations don't propagate quickly unless they're profitable.
You had a comment about CPR being so well known in Seattle. Could you elaborate on?
Well, maybe you know more than I do, but Seattle has always been said to be one of the cities where everybody's trained to be quick to recognize and treat a cardiac arrest. True, not true?
It's actually true. King County, Washington has the highest cardiac save rate in the entire country.
Right.
It's a good place to have a heart attack.
Another movie here. Anybody know this one? Alien, very good. So here's our star, Sigourney Weaver. And, the wood frog is a little tiny frog that gets cold and it turns into a frog sickle. So it just stays in the ice until it warms up, and then it hops off. And the way it's able to do that is it synthesizes an antifreeze that goes into its bloodstream. So you can imagine, in the same way that we have frost-resistant strawberries, we might have frost-resistant space travelers at some point in the future. A little theoretical, but we are using cold in medicine quite a bit, and we'll see more and more of it. Stem cells, it's always sort of been said that, according to intelligent design, which I gather we might have some of here in Seattle, that you need two of a species in order to propagate the species after a flood or a nuclear attack. And this is Brian, what is this movie? Evan Almighty. All you need really is one of these. This is a blastocyst. And this is a multicellular one, but at some point it's just one cell. And all the information that makes you, me is in here somewhere. So stem cells are totipotent. They can make anything. The information is in that cell. We know what nature's doing, but we really don't exactly yet understand how. And the goal in the next administration is to figure that out. Genomics. So this is another movie here. It's particularly applicable for me and my family. I have this guy here is one of twins, and they're about as similar as these two guys. They're brothers, and they're quite different. They're fraternal. They have different genetic underpinnings, which, is intuitive to all of us. But DNA is going to tell us a lot that we don't know yet about how the human works and how diseases work. So for about $30 or $40 million, the first human genome was decoded 5 or 6 years ago, and that was Craig Venter. Last year, James Watson's DNA was decoded for $1 million. Now the goal is to get a $1,000 copy of your own gene pool on a CD. And companies are offering that now. So it becomes affordable, and drug companies are interested in buying that information because then they can manufacture their drugs appropriately. And that's about phenotype versus genotype. And let me describe this in a second. So if you had to guess, is this animal more closely related to that animal or this animal? Right. It's intuitive. It's big, it's fat, it's ugly, it's got stumpy legs. It actually has some jawbone patterns that are the same. They're very remote genetically. Phenotypically, they look the same, but it turns out that the whale and the hippopotamus are much more closely related. So, in the same way that we talk about those things, we could say that breast cancer 1 and breast cancer 2 look very similar, so they're the same, so we should treat them the same, when in reality, they're genetically or genotypically very different. So, we used to talk about diseases like dropsy. We don't talk about that anymore. That was an old label. Now we talk about congestive heart failure. But in the next decade, as more genomic information becomes available, cancer 1 and cancer 2 are going to all be relabeled. Diseases will be relabeled because we understand the genetic underpinnings of it. So it's a huge change. Nobody's really, as we think about it in the room, we don't, what does that mean? That's what's going to happen. We're going to relabel everything and we're going to treat them all differently. This is the last chapter of the book. This is my father was an internist, and he was a very good internist, and he would sit down, and I use this my father's feet thing because he told me a story about it. At one point he had a patient that he met for the first time, and he'd like to sit down and talk to his patient. So he put this woman across from him, and he put his feet up on his desk, and he talked to her and learned later on that she was very offended by his casualness. And his thinking, it was a way to sort of allow some free give and take. And they went on to be a long-term physician and patient. And many of us would love that time nowadays with our physicians, right? There's no time for that kind of thing. But medicine in the home, you'd like ideally to marry up, the old country doc from Star Trek with the tricorder of the future. You want that human guy with the high-tech stuff. And I think that, I don't know what we'll see in the way of that, but that's certainly possible. This is Intel's home healthcare thing. Those of you that are in the healthcare side of this, or I don't know how much Microsoft's health thing is represented here in the audience, but this home-based monitoring equipment is coming. And it's not going to be paid for by insurance. You're going to buy it. And the thing that sort of perfectly typifies this for me is there was a bookstore that Barnes & Noble down the street from us that was replaced by a Walgreens or a CVS or something recently. And it was just sort of emblematic for me because it's 100 yards from another competitor and a couple hundred yards from another one. It's pharmacy, 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 pharmacy. Bookstores are gone. We're preoccupied with health. So you're going to have this on the shelves of the CVS, and books will all go away, except in the Kindle. And, medicine is moving from the hallowed ground of the hospital and the doctor's office into your home. And we know more about information, good or bad, on the internet than we ever did before. There's no longer, I'm not a priest anymore as a physician. The guy can come in with me and argue and say, no, you got it wrong. I read about it on the internet. So Microsoft's idea of this health vault where you have the consumer, you have devices up here that are in the home, you have the pharmacies wired up. This is what's coming. I mean, this is that network I talked about in the past. This is an end run on the healthcare systems. Google's technology, Microsoft's technology, we're going to buy it. And I had this discussion with people recently. We've got these sort of clunky hospital healthcare networks, software, and we said, well, we'll give them the software. The guy, the IT guy said, the CIO said, well, we'll have a pen home consumer health record. And I said, no, you won't. I mean, why would what happens if somebody comes from Seattle to Philadelphia and they're on Microsoft's EMR? How is that going to work? You need to recognize that these things, I believe that this is the way things will move quickly because it's an end run. I want to conclude with two slides. This is the actual causes of death in the United States in 1990 and 2000. So they did a 1990 version of it and 2000 version of it. Not the apparent cause, like heart attack, or as we would say on a coroner's report, cardiac arrest. Everybody dies of a cardiac arrest. But what's the underpinning cause here? Well, it turns out that there are 9 or 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's nine causes in Western society that account for 50% and 48% of the actual causes of death in Western society. So it's tobacco, poor diet, physical inactivity, alcohol consumption, microbial agents, toxic agents, cars, guns, sexual behavior, illicit drug use. It's half of it. It's appalling. And, Feynman, I read about this in one of his books, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, said something to the effect that one of the ways that he used to approach complicated problems was to take a giant step backwards and say, well, what if I were a Martian and I came upon this problem? How would I think about this? And I think that if we were Martians and we looked at the way that we behave as humans in terms of what we do to make ourselves sick and then what we spend on getting ourselves better, this would be some of the reactions that they might have. So I say this at the end of this thing because I'm not taken with all of this technology. It's coming. It will change us. It will change medicine. But the bottom line is the only way we can afford it in the first place and the only way that we can really deal with this is to take a step back and look at ourselves and say, you got a lot of responsibility on your own for your health care. And we have to take care of ourselves. So with that, I'll conclude and entertain any questions you all have. I ran a little bit longer than I expected, but hopefully that was because of the questions. Thank you. Yeah.
This may be getting somewhat out of the area you feel comfortable talking about, but there was recently an opportunity for us here to get individually genotyped at a very deep discount.
Great.
The concern that's been raised is that the legal infrastructure hasn't caught up, and we might be putting ourselves at risk because I could get a CD that shows that I am very likely to get cancer 3 years hence. I'm not going to be able to get insurance anymore.
Huge, huge problem. Yeah. I feel very comfortable with it because it's come up, over the years. We have siblings of breast cancer patients who come in to find out if they've got it, but if they've got it, then somebody finds out, then you're hosed, right? The insurance company finds out. So it's a big, big issue, and I don't pretend to have the answers. But it's like all these other questions that have to do with how much privacy are you willing to give away for the perceived gain, whether it's financial information or what have you. I don't know the right answer, but this is an option now. And as a society, we have to grapple with, all this stuff. Do you want to go there? I mean, the movie Gattaca, which some of you may have seen, was a perfect example of that taken to an extreme. Gattaca, for those of you who know, you'd sort of come into the Microsoft front desk there, instead of giving my driver's license, I get my finger pricked, and they check, am I alpha, beta, or a gamma, and like that. So, I don't know. Yeah.
So this is a question about privacy. What about on the safety and security side? What do you see as kind of the biggest challenges for these emerging techniques in medicine, computers being so involved in remote care and things like that?
Yeah, well, I think there are examples of things that we can point to in automation that work very well. A lot of automated, so the same sorts of control chips that run dryers and air conditioners have been used to run subway cars and autopilots with a very good safety record. But on the other hand, I've been in medicine now long enough to see things that were the best new thing that turned out 5 or 10 years later to be horrible. And with the computer-oriented things, I think we'll know pretty quickly that this was a bad idea, or this really works well. The McSleepy, So it may be that we put the automated anesthesia device at the bedside for a while. It turns out, after a while, anesthesiologists just aren't necessary. Or you need one anesthesiologist for 10 rooms as opposed to one for one room. We'll know that quickly. But some of these things like these implanted devices, where you stick something inside the body and only find out X number of years later that there's really, like you think about some of these, the drugs that were used for morning sickness and the issues that, I'm blanking right now. Thalidomide. I had a discussion with my mother about this recently. She said, everybody got thalidomide. And then you don't know for some period of time that you've done, or DES, diethylstilbestrol. Your daughter, 30 years later, is at high risk for cervical cancer because it's some choice that you made unawares. And really, you can't point anybody to say they knew. They didn't know. It's just that. So I don't know. I don't know which ones will be ones that are good ones and which ones are bad ones. But to me, the driving thing at this point in medicine has to be cost reduction through high technology. Ideally with some overarching effort to preserve what happens between a physician and a patient, that special, or a nurse practitioner, or provider and a patient, that special thing that we go to. It goes right back to that first slide. I don't know if you were here at the beginning, but when you go into a hair salon or somebody massages your back, you're looking for some human touch. That's some fundamental need. We need to keep that. We don't want to have robots providing that for us, I don't think. Yeah.
As you see these new technologies come online and get commercialized, especially in terms of devices, do you see, in your experience, many of these technologies, most of them coming out of established players or out of startups?
Both. I'll give you a perfect example. So, again, I don't know if you were here at the beginning, but I had the eye in the sky. So, 10 years ago, two guys, friends of mine from Hopkins, came up to me, and they were working out of an office building with two other guys, a couple of programmers and a business guy. They were both intensivists. They said, Bill, we'd like you to come join our startup. And I said, that sounds pretty cool. Maybe I'll go join your startup. So I dickered with them for a while, and for a variety of reasons, I came to a branch point. I could go do a sabbatical at Princeton in the computer science department, which I ended up doing, or go with these guys who worked in Baltimore, put my family at some risk, and I chose to do the former. They went on in the succeeding 10 years to develop a company that was sold for $500 million to Philips, a year or two ago. Startup, two guys with an idea. On the other hand, a lot of these technologies require, like these nanotechnology things, require a big upfront investment. So, yeah.
I was interested by your slide with the underlying causes of death, and where a lot of them are very much under our control. And I'm curious about the latest and greatest things that you've seen, and the most promising things that you've seen that could help people change their own behavior.
Wow. I haven't seen many of them. I did see a cell phone that you could attach a breathalyzer device to. There's an iPhone plug-in that that's apparently doing very well in Hollywood. That you can get your blood alcohol reading. But no, I haven't seen many that really fit.
A dimension that you think is promising, like technology and help individuals.
Yeah, you guys, listen. Work on it because we need it. It's ridiculous. I work with young trauma patients, and these kids in West Philadelphia come in, and we had a guy that was 2 years in the ICU, shot through the neck, died, 20-year-old kid. In so many ways that doesn't make sense. Motor vehicle accidents the same way. It's just, I don't know exactly how to answer that, but there's a lot of there. Yeah, somebody over here? Yes?
Well, just on that back thing, was a section of lung of a smoker in a jar of formaldehyde that caused my brother and I not to pursue that hobby.
That's an oldie but a goodie. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Buying both of us a 2.5 cent cigar and making us smoke it down to the very end. So that pretty much wiped out our...
Well, yeah, my father, as I said, was a physician, and I did smoke at one point, I have to say, and that approach works. So there was also the good one for drivers, Ed. Go back to your question. You bring them in and you show them what happens when you're a bad driver teenager with the thing through your head kind of thing. Low tech, yeah.
So, do you think that the healthcare institutions represented in your early slide by the small little well are healthcare with a pot of resources? How do they have the financial capacity to realize the investments or to help in the commercialization of all of those technologies? I mean, I can't see them replacing, hey, let's shut down the MRI and let's open up the proton. They're going to say, let's add the proton, add the MRI, keep the CT. We'll still do, bilateral X-rays.
Yeah, I think these guys. I deal with them a lot as the chief medical person for this ICU telemedicine thing. We go out and talk to them and say, hey, look, do you want to hire a suite of intensivists, or do you want to subscribe to this service, which is cheaper? So they have a difficult balancing act. The high quality local hospitals actually are doing pretty well financially. If they have a couple of flagship services and they do good community stuff, and they keep. I mean, you want to have a community resource, but you want to also be able to go to the good place when you need the big thing done. So they're doing okay if they're well run. If they're poorly run, they're in trouble, and they will be increasingly in trouble. And when I showed that to me is the big pot. It's also the smaller pot. That water well. But they're not making choices like the CT versus the MRI. They're making choices like, do I bring in this hospital subsidized service, or do I bring in this one that brings money into the hospital? Do I have employed radiologists, or do I subscribe to Nighthawk, these guys in Australia, that kind of thing? Yeah. Yes?
Do you think there's resistance in the medical community to software that performs a medical diagnosis? You seem to be okay with it.
Well, yeah, within limits. Again, I would go back to the analogy. So if it's a black box thing, like the financial instruments that were conceived of by very bright people like yourself, and like the math guys that emigrated from academics into the finance world, that's a problem, because then you don't really know what the guys who run those companies didn't know what those guys were doing. They just were geniuses because they were making money. To the degree that things are transparent or reasonably transparent. So, I said something about neural fuzzy. I don't know if you know about the difference between, in neural networks is black box, fuzzy is, it's there. You can see how you constructed the thing. And if you marry them up, you can sort of get the best of both worlds in some way of thinking. So I think that's the kind of stuff that people are probably okay with. You can say, I understand how this thing works. I agree with the principles under which it works, and it seems to behave well. The people that are not troglodytes, or people who just are opposed to technology, are okay with that. Some people are early adopters and they get themselves into trouble saying this is great and it's not. Yeah.
I think so. Most of the high tech in medicine got adopted because people saw that as a way to increase revenues, whereas now you're talking about using technology to become more efficient. That's a pretty significant cultural shift and goes against the business models that are established today. So what do you think will prompt that?
Well, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but to me, it's how do you create? Where do you put the incentives? If the incentives is for cost reduction behavior, as opposed to the incentives is for creating a bariatric specialty hospital, then you can change behavior. Do you know what I mean?
What forces do you see playing out that will make that shift more likely? I guess that's because currently all the incentives are migrated.
Well, let me give you a sort of a coarse example. Okay, so medicine is still kind of like a cottage industry. There are a lot of people who do it. I have my special way of doing this or treating this disease. There are clearly emerging concepts of best practices. So there's low-hanging fruit that says if you reduce this kind of infection, you save a lot of money. So the government has put into place pay-for-performance incentives that say, we'll pay you more if you reduce this kind of behavior, but if you have a lot of this kind of behavior, we're going to pay you less, or we won't pay you for that treatment. So, you know, if you have a lung infection when you're in the hospital on a ventilator, that's something that the government will say, you know what, we're not going to pay for that. It's your fault. That's your bad. Because we've seen other hospitals that don't have the same kind of behavior. That's a simple course example, but that's what's coming. Yeah.
Can I just comment on a different example?
Sure.
Of that? In order to be more productive and make more profits, you need to be more efficient. I came prior to Microsoft from the healthcare industry where I worked at a community health center. And we were the first one in Washington State to do all electronic medical records from the minute the patient literally clocks in. We timed how long they were in the waiting room, how long it took for the doctor to go back and visit them, how long it took from them to get their prescription. I mean, we just were able to track the whole thing. And because of that, we knew where our deficiencies were, and we were able to restaff, reorg, and do what it took so that we could see more patients, get more visits in, etc. And it was extremely profitable for our clinic.
Yeah, I mean that's the top layer. Those same sorts of things, you push them down, can make you money. If it's, yeah. Okay, one more question. Or we're done.
Great.
Thank you guys.
So much.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.